Good morning, James Carvin here again with a promised review of a book by Corey L. Brown and with the support of his beautiful wife that I met the other day at the park. Her name is Cheryl, and I promised him I'd review his book, which is called Ubuntu. When I saw the title Ubuntu, all of a sudden my heart leapt, because anything that has to do with us being united as a human species and with the world that we're in charge to care for, to the extent that any of us are, is something that makes my heart leap. And so I did. And then he explained to me very quickly, he says, well, it's about the kingdom. Well, of course, that really made my heart even leap more when he said that, and he introduced himself as a pastor of a local church. We hadn't met until that moment. He had a booth out of what was called the Word of South. It was a festival at Cascades Park, and he had lots of books, and he signed my book for me, and that was real blessing to me and my wife Lisa. We were there together taking a stroll in the park. So here's the review. It turned out to be not what I expected. What I expected was the sense of Ubuntu that one might find in the Bible. And now I've been to seminary, a Catholic seminary, and it was the regional seminary in South Florida in Boynton Beach called St. Vincent de Paul, where I did not complete my master's degree. I did finish my master's degree up at another smaller unaccredited college. It was an Orthodox college, so that's another story. But see, now I'm wearing my pomologist's thinking cap today, and so I have the sprocket of innovation and the top hat of excellence, which is my philosophical garb. And because the Pomology Society is a philosophical society, and if it's kingdom oriented at all, which it certainly is, because Pomology is the philosophy of awesomeness, or awesomology. And when we get serious about the logic of awesomeness, when we say, okay, well, what's the most awesome thing conceivable, then we maybe imagine a multiverse where every single good thing that can happen does happen, and where no bad things are happening. It's a pretty fundamental, somewhat almost mathematical concept that may be a construct that's detached from the real world for some of us. And we want to kind of come down from that mountain of abstract thought into the real world of, well, how can we make our lives the most awesome that we can, given the universe that we see and think or try to understand. So now this morning, as another anecdote, I found this, my wife spotted a lens. I don't know how she's found it when she couldn't see without her glasses on, but it was a good 10 feet away. And this was the lost lens. I don't know if you can see that. Let me bring it up closer to the camera so you can see what that was. When you lose a lens, they're not easy to find. Well, what does that have to do with my review of this book, Ubuntu and the Word, a primer of Afrodiasporan biblical rhetoric? That's the subtitle, a primer of Afrodiasporan. Some people might pronounce that Afrodiasporan. It doesn't really matter whether you mispronounce it or not. The idea and biblical rhetoric. Let's break that down in this review, because I want to summarize this book. All right, so a primer, that's an introduction, not meant to be comprehensive, of Afrodiasporan. That rather than talking about Afro-Americans, let's face it, Africans have emigrated all over the world, and their experience matters. And so that's what the book is essentially about. It's the Black experience worldwide. I would think that's what he was aiming at. And then biblical rhetoric. I love that concept, biblical rhetoric, because what's the language of your spirituality and your faith and your understanding, whether you're a Christian or not? Oddly, he's not really talking about to Christians and aiming this primarily at Christians. Do you know who I think he really is aiming the book at? Is his own peers in a school of theology, a very, very narrow group of people. I think he went to the McAfee School of Theology and got his Master's of Divinity there. Okay, if I'm inaccurate, I'm going to invite the Browns to come in and correct me on anything. Well, so what is it that made my heart leap when I saw the word Ubuntu? Well, I'll let you buy the book and read what Ubuntu means to the Browns. But for me, what Ubuntu meant and what I expected when it was described as a kingdom sort of Ubuntu was, and I can only bring my white Eurocentric perspective. Well, okay, let me say that I am not being serious when I call myself Eurocentric. Let's talk about lenses, because as a white man, heterosexual, and getting a little elderly, I'm starting to experience what it's like to be a little older man and to start to be a somewhat underprivileged as the elderly class might be. And I've explored the concept of privilege throughout my life. And do you know, I would have to say that when your peers are in academia, you do think differently. You really are sort of out of touch, to be very honest, in an academic environment. You'll learn words, and then you'll sort of meditate on those new words that you've heard. And so, obviously, the word Afrodiasporan is a concept to really chew on, to really think about through the years. And so when you add something to rhetoric, it gives you something to think about. And that's why the lens is important, because I don't see through the lens very easily of somebody else that's not in my particular subclass of humanity. And but when you give me the word Ubuntu, I'm thinking Ubuntu of the entire tribe, of the whole human family, and the entire animal kingdom and plant kingdom. I'm thinking of my oneness in terms of responsibility, not because I'm lower than the plants. One day I shall be, but and then raised again in glory if all goes according to our hope in glory, right? So, to me, kingdom living is very much Ubuntu. It's very much understanding that even despite the fact that I can't see through the lens of the struggle of somebody in some other subclass of humanity, or an animal for that matter. You hear the barking dogs, the birds out here. I love being united in nature and trying to guess what all of these little tweets and ribbits and barks are all about, because animals matter to me. And so everything ought to matter. A truly aware person should just be alert to how they can maximize awesomeness, and their awesomeness, but our awesomeness, right? That's our responsibility. That's a kingdom command to me. And when I look at through the lens of a Eurocentric, which well, my family's been in the United States. We don't have anybody that's been in Europe now for about 4 or 5 generations. So, let me introduce my lovely wife. She's in the living room there, and the camera is catching her. She gets about. She has a disability. But so we had the wheelchair out there in the park, and but she had a stroke about 21 years ago. Has anybody really looked through the lens of a person who's disabled? That wasn't covered in the book. There were 3 classes of people that the book covers. Okay, so basically it's just the black experience, and then he also covers the woman's experience, and then he goes into the black gay experience. He singles out those 3 subgroups of humanity, and it's really well worth asking and meditating on what it might be to try to imagine living a life as one of those, any of these. All right, I'm not a woman, I will never be able to do it. I'm heterosexual, I'm not black, I'm disqualified, and I'm not the Speaker of the House that has every imaginable part of diversity within myself. So, God bless America. But but loving one another is a very simple command for everybody, and I had expected the book to talk about how the apostles of Jesus, after the resurrection and the Holy Spirit had descended on them, and after the Word of God started going out about the message of Jesus, that the fact that everyone shared all that they had was where the book was going to go. But it didn't go there. Instead, it talked quite a bit about liberation theology. Now, when I went to seminary in the 1980s at the seminary that was designed to train up priests in the Caribbean basin, we learned all about liberation theology there, although it was primarily Latin liberation theology. And so the mid-1980s, this was before the wall of Berlin came down, right? And so the Cold War was at an all-time high. And it was an interesting experience for me personally, because I had just graduated with a degree in music composition from the University of South Carolina, but my music portfolio had been lost. And so I had nothing to show for all of the work up to that time that I had done. And so I was struggling to get work. I was a trombone player with medium skill, and it was not enough to be the guy that's going to go do those solos in the big band and tour, okay? I also had a little bit of stage fright, to be honest with you, so performance was never going to be my thing on stage, and I knew that. It was a little disappointing. I had hoped I could overcome that. Now I have, because I became what I was supposed to become in terms of my vocation by heading to that seminary and learning a thing or two. Now, it's very academic. The idea that in a Catholic seminary, of all places, we would be learning about liberation theology may come to a shock to some people. And then to others who don't even know what liberation theology is, I should touch on that. So, in essence, it's a new way of meditation. When you see the word theology, it's about reflection. It's about consideration. And when you talk about liberation, let's consider how liberation fits in with the gospel. Well, certainly the liberation of the Jewish slaves in Egypt is at the core of Scripture. Their deliverance from slavery is at the heart of the Bible and of the Jewish experience. Now, right now, the Jewish experience is very different. And we're not all Jews. We're us Gentiles have different senses of liberation that are required. So women's liberation is part of that. And we also have the I can never get the order of the letters right, and it drives my wife batty. My wife is Lisa, who's a spell check freak, and so I was a LGBTQT or LBGQT plus drives her crazy because I still never can get it. But each of those abbreviated letters is for a group: gays, bisexuals, queer, and lesbians, and and all the other categories, right? There's their plus. And so whatever our orientation is, we need a liberation. And if somebody wants to disagree with that, you have a lot of conservatives that are conservative and biblical and evangelical backlash against movements forward to legitimize this underclass. Whatever that may be, we need to recognize that we are all enslaved by sin, and we all need deliverance from whatever is imperfect in this world, most especially ourselves. And yet the struggle is real because we can't just overcome that. We're still in the chains of oppression. I always loved Psalm 103. The Greek word for the oppressed is adikomenes. And it's what, when we anglicize that, it's the addicts. And so some of the most powerful ministries in the church are substance abuse ministries. And so you have believers in recovery, right? And it seems like a good fit, actually, to be honest with you, when you talk about as a first step in any 12-step program, recognizing there's a problem and that only God or a higher power can deliver you from, so that the recovery programs being a part of the churches makes pretty good sense. So we all need this deliverance, and we're not capable of doing it ourselves. Well, so I'm going to give you my backstory. I hadn't expected this review to come in this direction, but in essence, I find in this book something more of a political story than a spiritual one. However, you can't divorce spirituality and the religious experience from the political experience, because the political and emotional and sense of justice and injustice and our need for a better world are tied in with both the political activism that Reverend Brown is interested in and conveying and sharing, and and what we as Christians can do. Okay, so when you have a status quo, I think that he's concerned about the Eurocentric status quo, and that is part of what liberation needs to become. So if an evangelical is content to be to not engage in political activism because they have this sort of two-dimensional relationship with God where they're getting saved, but it hasn't broadened itself out to embrace the rest of humanity and our calling within that, then you are losing an important lens that could enhance your worship, your relationship in grace, and in your command to love one another as you were first loved. It becomes much more than a command when you're always seeing as others see, to the extent that the human mind and heart are capable of embracing that sort of oneness. So, as a white man, what do I do when I am asked to consider black liberation theology? Well, it's a genuinely wonderful calling to all Christians, especially those who are Eurocentric, to step outside of themselves and say, hey, look, there's a part of the world that you're not really putting into your heart, into your experience. And that's essential and very important. Now, when I went to school yet again at Arizona State University, got my degree in philosophy, and organizational leadership, and I've taken my courses in politics. I was a little surprised that this book by Bell Hooks wasn't mentioned when it came to the women's liberation theology, feminist theory from margin to center. Because if anybody's been marginalized in society, it's not, I mean, you take the feminist movement, and what about black feminism? All right, so Bell Hooks, I thought, did a great job in really highlighting the fact that there's nobody that's more of an underclass than a black woman. So if the white feminists are looking for equal opportunity, they tend to, she says, tends to think in terms of corporate leadership and growth within large companies and advancement, where your sorority girls have a chance. And so that sort of feminism, equal pay for equal work in the executive circles, is where white feminism tends to gravitate, whereas black feminism is one where you experience what it's like to live on the other side of tracks and to have to go to work and to have to pay for the daycare and to have to pay for to just work a minimum wage job, cleaning some rich person's house or something like that. Now, this was written a long time ago, and fortunately, the black female experience has changed to the better to some extent, where there has been more opportunity and that has equaled things out a little bit. But we do have a welfare state to concern ourselves with, and I think that if we're going to be exercising, putting on other lenses, then I would challenge those of a progressive mindset to put on the mindset as well of those people who understand and can analyze the experience of the welfare state as one of being a new form of a plantation. Because when we have no escape, we may not be experiencing the torture that existed on some plantations. I've read the stories. Now, I mean, if you really want to go into it, black women were not allowed to marry when black men were being raised as studs and moved on. They were there to be impregnated and to raise up. Now, they weren't all like this, okay? There were probably a good number of very humanist-minded the people who hadn't totally lost their humanity, that were slave owners, had plantations. My brother, Joseph William Carvin, wrote a book, and so and he was a genealogist in my family. You can look up his book, Alameth, and it will tell you a story about Julia Byers and the Byers plantation. So I know that 5 generations ago on my mother's side, there were some slave owners, maybe 6 generations, I haven't counted them. But there were some slave owners, and that Julia Byers wanted to run a school for blacks to help them become literate, and then she was accused of being an abolitionist during the Civil War and in the years prior to the Civil War. So there were some good plantation owners, and there were some bad ones as well. And so part of what the story is what the life experience was for those who wanted to do the right thing, as Eurocentric as their thinking may have been, okay, at that time, which had a long way to go when you were living in an environment that justified that sort of a thing. But you know, to be a world changer is no easy thing. We all have very limited power, and we're working within a society and a larger political context wherein making great changes has to be done in baby steps and may take decades to accomplish. Let's face it. And I can give you a perfect example going back to my own work in something called incentivized asenalegonomy. So now that's a big word, So if we're talking about rhetoric, let me introduce asenalegonomy. It's a Greek word that I coined, but somebody coined the word Afrodiasporan, so I feel it's only fair that I can introduce the word asenalegonomy. It's a Greek word, a being the prefix that means not, and senalagon, which means trade. So if you had an economy that didn't have trade, you'd have an asenalegonomy. Asenalegonomy is a tradeless economy. It's a resource-based economy where there's no such thing as money. There's no such thing as trade. Well, obviously there would be no slave trade if there was no trade. And so that's a start for those with the mindset of the Afro-diaspora. But there's also the fact that I coupled it with another word, incentivized. So let me offer some criticism to what I came to quickly as soon as I started seeing liberation theology on the title and in the subjects that were going to be covered of different types. I started to think, oh, liberation theology as I knew it were communist movements back in the 1980s, while the Soviet Union still had a union. And it was a Soviet one, it wasn't just Russia. Now we have Russia, and we have China, and we have national socialist states. We don't have a worldwide global effort to expand and unite and control the entire globe with that sort of socialism or communism. Now, of course, I've read the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, and I see that he believed, and Engels, that there would be a class warfare in the clash between the workers and the owners, right? And that struggle still very much exists because of what? Because of trade. Because when we give ourselves in service for somebody else for a number of hours to do something, then we become dehumanized because we voluntarily or involuntarily allow ourselves to be slaves to that clock. And we may own some things as a result of that, so it's not slavery, but it is a form of indentured servitude at the least, even if it's just for a day, and or for 9 to 5 or what have you. But my point is, you're trading your hours for service to somebody else, and you're using your resources, which in this case is yourself, and you're giving it to somebody else. But in a competitive capitalist world, the value of what you are keeps being driven down as others with skills come to compete against you. And so Marx was aiming at that sort of dehumanization. And you lose the sense because all of your work is being sold to somebody else. You don't get to keep any of it. That's very dehumanizing. So there's this decoupling of our work from what's meaningful to us personally, other than this dollar symbol that we gain by it to whatever extent. So that's the essence, I think, of Marx's argument, and he also thinks that religion, and Lenin, of course, the idea that religion is being supplanted as an opium of the people is a very sad thing, that the only thing that we have left in our humanity is the hope that we have in our resurrection and the beauty of heaven after this world is all over. So we're going to give our whole lives in this world, but at least we have a heavenly hope, right? Well, that is a Eurocentric thought, if there ever was one. Because in this capitalist world, where we're constantly being shoved down and dehumanized, that's going to be what we see. And that is going to be what our hope is left with, which in a sense is maybe a very good thing. That's why my namesake, James, is saying, but blessed is a brother of humble circumstances. He must glory in his high position, and the rich in his humiliation, since like the flowering grass, he's going to pass away. And so he, especially in chapter 5, has some serious words for the rich when he says, Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten, and your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will stand as a witness against you. Is it in the last days that you have stored up your treasure? Behold, the wages of those who mowed your fields, which you withheld from them, cries out to the Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. And the cries of those who harvested them has reached the Lord of hosts. It cries out against you. The wages are crying out against you. I won't go on. My point is that the Lord has something very serious to say about greedy capitalism. And he doesn't like it. So if we were to reread the Bible and see these things in there, then we might, I think, honestly, that when politics takes over seminaries, that really you wind up with a progressive liberalism, and the hope is that you would become a progressive liberal, to be honest with you about that. And so I want to go back to my personal experience in offering this review. I know what it's like to be wealthy because I grew up as a very wealthy man. My father was in the top 1% of the top 1%. So I know what it's like. And I was just a little boy at that time. And my father, being an alcoholic, wound up losing his good job at the Allied Chemical Corporation. But he had enough money so he could own his own business. And so he started a company. It was a seatbelt manufacturing company. He also was tied in with the mafia somehow. I don't know. I wasn't privy to any of the dealings. I was just a little boy. And he kept it all very hidden, but a lot of research has uncovered this through the years. And so he was offered to use the Queen Elizabeth II as a money laundering operation. He had Lucky Luciano's pocket watch, which my brother sold when he was addicted to his cocaine. He sold it in a garage sale or something. Horrible what happened. My grandfather used to run booze to the boardwalk, we're pretty certain. We don't have proof of this, but he was the only person who knew how to fly a plane and wound up with a nice place in Ventnor. But he married into money, the Murphy family. Now, all of this, you can find out about all of these stories in the book, the other book that my brother wrote, Joseph W. Carvin. It's called The Philadelphians, and it'll talk you about different lives in Philadelphia and how two families, the Carvin family on the one side and the Murphy family on the other side, which eventually united the prince and the pauper, so to speak, where my grandfather, the Carvin, who's been raised up, now the Irish experience very different in America than the black experience, to be sure, but understand that there's two worlds among the Irish, and the Catholics were a minority, and they were Catholic, and so their church got burnt down by the Protestants in Philadelphia. But my great-grandfather Murphy was wealthy enough, and by the way, these are not the slave owners; these are people that were in the textile business. And and he knew how to work with looms, and so he would rent out hand looms in the industrial age when everybody was turning to the machinery. But when it came times to actually have need of the hand loomers and the wool importing that was going on, especially in the Second World War, somebody had to make the uniforms. And the train lines had been disconnected, and so my quintuple great-grandfather Murphy wound up selling to the government because he still had his connections to Ireland where they would import wool. And so that gave the Union armies. All right, so that's that's a long story. Read the Philadelphians and you'll see how that worked out. So he becomes very wealthy, but the Carvin's still at the bottom of the rung at that point. And then my grandfather married into some serious money. He marries a debutante. And that had a lot to do with, it takes money to make money. This is a reality I know very well. So if you go to the Pomology Society and you look for our mission, you'll see that the idea is to take concept stage businesses and crowdsource and crowdfund them. And the reason is that I've had a life of poverty ever since my father had his bankruptcy, lost all of his money. So I grew up in privilege, but I also know what it's like to lose that privilege. And so I've led a life of horrible struggle, especially since my wife had her stroke. But I once had a good government job, which I lost in 1998. Tried to start a business prematurely. I had hoped to start that business with money, knowing you do need money and something steady to do something with. But I'm not going to go into the story of how I lost my job at the post office, but it was cushy. It was a very cushy government job I had, and then I lost it. I will say that it was connected with an affirmative action issue when I got a transfer, and then I lost my job because of that. So basically, because I wasn't black, I actually lost a good government job that I had had. Now, I didn't really particularly resent that. I was interested in fairness, but for me, because of the circumstances I was in at that time, it was very, very difficult, and ever since that day, my life has been extremely difficult, trying to work a life without much of a set of skills other than working at the post office. It's not an easy thing to do, to step out of that and into the world to do other things. And yet these are very much first world problems that I'm describing, because I managed to make it. I kept a roof over my head, and I fed my family, my 2 children and my wife. I've taken care of them. And if I was black, maybe I wouldn't have been able to do that. Or if I'd been a black woman, or if I'd have been a gay black woman or a gay black, I might not have had what it took to even survive. I might have turned to welfare and never qualified for welfare. I was always $1 too much income to qualify for it. Even when my wife had her stroke and she's been paralyzed in one side ever since, I didn't have turned to welfare, though she did get disability. So, but anyway, this is a story about me, which I need to go back to, because my father was a conservative. He supported Ronald Reagan, and he was a conservative. So when I graduated from school without a job, I wound up working at a bank. It was a savings and loan, and it was a new branch, brand new. If you ever work in a brand new bank, you don't have customers yet. And that's what happened to me. So I'm working at a bank. I was making $5 an hour. I had a lot of extra time at the bank once all the work was caught up. So I would just sit there at my desk and read and wait until customers came in. I read literally volumes of books at that time. And it was interesting because I was assessing my life, and I realized that we were really wasting our time, it seemed like to me, because I wasn't really producing any tangible goods or services for anyone other than to manage their money so they could do whatever they do with money. Maybe sometimes they'd spend their money on something, but what was being built? What was being made? Well, who was being served and how by all these transactions? Oh, you're going to earn a little more. I'm going to get a little more in your account. You're going to make a withdrawal. You're going to make a deposit. You're going to get a little more interest. So I realized that all we're really doing is something that doesn't directly affect anybody. And I hated it. It was absolutely meaningless. Whereas music, you're producing something that gives somebody some pleasure. You have a direct relationship with the thing that makes life more awesome for somebody. Now, as awesome as it is to know that in the future you might be able to do some things with the money that you have, it's also not anything tangible in the moment. And so this is what I was being frustrated by, because what I did was I did a little mathematics. I added up how much time was spent on doing nothing more than adding up and protecting money. And so I figured, well, all the people that are in the administrative side of businesses that are not actually producing products or services, all those jobs, all those people, all that effort and labor could be redirected towards actual production. And I looked at the insurance business, the advertising business, the banking business, the investing side, the stock market, and I realized that probably 70 to 80% of what we do, having jobs, has nothing to do with actually producing goods or services, and that if you repurposed all of those personnel to actually working and doing something and bettering our resources, that we would then multiply our efficiency by a factor of 5. And now that we have machines, we could do that even more. Have them do our work for us and multiply our productivity by gajillions. Who knows the exact numbers? But my point is, I recognize that it was a very inefficient system, and that maybe the communists were right. Maybe what we needed was a world that had no money. Now, I was pretty naive about this thought, but as conservative as my father was, I was on the very opposite side of the spectrum. And when I brought this home to my father says, you do realize that no communist experiment has ever worked. These people live in poverty, and so your idea about it being more efficient is just wrong. And then I looked more deeply into this whole matter, and I realized, well, no, those aren't communist states. Those are socialist states. Those still have money. Those people in those states, in what we are calling communist countries, are actually still very much working for money. They have salary. They still have ownership. They just have egalitarianism. They have equality of outcomes so that they all have to have the same stuff in the end. And so their work, very much like the very thing that Karl Marx was complaining about, is actually very meaningless, because they're not incentivized to do anything. Everybody has the same amount for no matter how hard they work. Well, so now let's go to that new word I introduced, incentivized asynagogy. The key to it all is to incentivize your tradeless economy, and so that there's some reward that you get if you do certain types of work. And if you do more quality work, there should be components of quality and type that go into what sort of privileges that a person should earn through the work that they choose to do. The only problem with that is if you take people like my wife, who's not able to do work because of her condition, then how fair is that to her? So my solution, which I call the HAND system, the Human Availability and Needs Database System, considers various factors, creates an algorithm out of that, and takes care of people like my wife who can't work by adding some factor to whatever work she does do, and then also offers a baseline. It says if anybody can't work, you can have something to be human out of mercy that comes from all of us being one, Ubuntu. And in that, she would be taken care of. Now, if she's married to somebody like me, she's not going to qualify for the same thing as she would as a single woman. So if she was a widower or widow in distress, as James calls it, the true spirituality, pure and undefiled religion is this, in the sight of our God and Father, is this: to visit the widow and the orphan in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. And then he goes on in the next chapter to chide us against showing partiality to the rich. All right, so that being the case, there's a system that could be devised that had some compromise between not egalitarianism but a base level humanitarianism and an incentivized system that would be designed to make sure that everything was functioning. Because every Marxist that I've talked to so far focuses on two things, and I find them to be both destructive things. And this is what I would warn about in this book. If you're going to talk about black liberation theology is about the indignation that Marx was calling for in order to make change. You have to stir people up to the point that they are going to force change. They will rebel. When Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff were involved in the Latin liberation theology movement, what did they do? Well, they stirred up revolution. They were killing each other. And I got in trouble at the seminary, frankly, for exposing the fact that the Mary Knoll nuns were shipping guns to the Sandinistas back in the 80s. And I didn't like the fact that this ideal of communism that I sort of liked naively, thinking, well, theoretically it should work, wasn't something that was actually being applied in the real world. What we had instead was all of these theologies of liberation that were stirring up people to become violent. Is that what liberation theology is? And when we focus solely on our own group and fail to see through the lens of everybody else's group, that's when we lose. We don't see one another. We don't feel one another. We don't know what the experience of the other is. We're going to have to turn to grace to work this out, because Jesus died for all of us, not for one group of us. And Ubuntu, if I was to criticize Ubuntu, there is a dark side to Ubuntu, because it's a tribal we. Now, so here's the thing about tribalism, is that it creates echo chambers, and an echo chamber is like a brainwashing system, and it's like a deliberate blinder to anybody else's truth. And that's what the problem is, because in these days, we need to be delivered from the darkness of the age of separated communication. Because we're separated in these different echo chambers where we're only hearing our own voices rather than combining as one humanity in a single voice. And that's why I invented the counter checker, by the way. Yes, I'm an inventor. So I did that. I invented the hand system. I invented the counter checker. The counter checker is a tool for civil dialogue between people to sort out differences and to communicate with each other, and in order to see the pros and cons of every point of view. That's what it is. It's the counter checker. So you have your facts and I have my facts. Now let's bring all these facts together and come to a deeper, more three-dimensional truth. Because honestly, when you're trying to look through glasses where one of the lenses is missing, it's really messed up. Okay? The counter checker brings the lenses together so that you have a better vision, and it becomes more precise, more accurate, and we deal with reality that way rather than attacking fake enemies. We keep attacking fake enemies. It's like the guy that wants to kill cancer, and so he comes up with this radiation treatment that destroys the heart, or it's just you go way too far with it. And there's no end to it, because once these movements start, they don't have a way to check and balance with one another to say, oh, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't kill all the women and children in this camp also. So that's the problem with liberation theology. Once you start a political movement, it's just got its agenda. Now you're paying a bureaucracy that's maintaining it, and they don't want to quit because they like the money that they're getting, and they will keep exploiting it. They're taught to do that. A lot of the best ones believe in what they do. There's nothing more hellish in the superhighway to hell than people that have good intentions and believe in what they do. If you were to get me to sin in a major way, you know how to do it? Get me to believe in something that's just a little bit off track. And I will do more destruction than the worst demon possibly could. And that's a horrible thing to think, but it's a frightful thing to be given some responsibility and to know what to do with it and to have the gumption to give up your own life for the service of God. You have to give up your pride. You have to give up your vocation, maybe, as you see it, and redefine your vocation and take a sharp turn, realizing that you've been fighting for the wrong side. And that's essential for all of us to reflect in our hearts whether that's the case. Now, and day by day, we need to reflect on these things and humbly walk with a daily light on that daily path. Otherwise, we're doomed, because we'll be walking in blindness. We'll be the blind leading the blind, and that is a quick path to destruction for all of humanity and misery for us all. So, Ubuntu, when it's tribalistic, hey, we're all together in our tribe. But that tribe over there, that's the enemy. Let's fight. Let's all unite together and fight that tribe over there, the enemy. That's not Ubuntu, is it? Well, it is. It is within your echo chamber, but it's not to the next tribe over. So when you create these subclasses of people and define them as tribes, that could be problematic, and I just want you to think that through. Oh, feminist, bell hooks and the Ubuntu, and it all ultimately comes down to here's the John Rawls, all right, where this all started in Harvard, right? So when you're looking for justice as fairness, and you want to have an ideology, a political ideology, there's a lot of beauty in some of these ideas. Because there's compassion and there's a mutual understanding of what it is to be human. Now, John Rawls talking about the democratic experiment in the United States primarily, where it's going to hit home here, but I think he also means it in general. If you're going to form a government, this is what the ideal government is going to accomplish. It's going to make sure that those who are most alienated politically have equal opportunity under the law to participate in the political process, and also those who are economically marginalized, that those are the ones that receive the help and are lifted up to the highest extent possible. That's the essence of John Rawls. And I think it's fair and it's good political philosophy, but unfortunately, because it tends to be very single-minded and focused on that one thing, it fails to look at the larger picture. That's when you start looking at a larger macroeconomic picture, then now you're dealing with a complexity that most of us will never be able to grasp. Okay, so whether you're into Keynesian economics or trickle-down economics, as it's pejoratively referred to, and don't really much appreciate the fact that if you put money in a bank, the bank has to invest that money. And now, if they're going to invest it in real estate and then just jack up my rent, then that's not helping the least of these, that's for sure. But if they're going to own and operate enterprises that ultimately will employ people, they don't really have a choice. So there must be some form of employment sooner or later in that larger formula. But you can see that the income gap has been widening for whatever reason, and it doesn't matter whether we have more taxes or less taxes, we're in deep crap. Now, one of the things that gets mentioned in here is reparations. And the idea that true reparations would probably quadruple our federal deficit. I don't know whether that's a reference to the accumulated deficit, which is what now, 34, 36 trillion, quadruple that, you're 130 or 40 trillion dollars what would that do to inflation? What would that do to our national stability? So there's some really naive thoughts that you can come up with about how to solve problems. And if you were entirely singly focused only on reparations as justice and fairness, and it brought down everybody else and the whole system collapsed in the process, a little wisdom just has to tell you, maybe you ought to keep that in check and find a balance somewhere in the middle. Virtus in medio was what our Eurocentric Thomas Aquinas was repeating under his, I guess that actually started with Aristotle, right? Maybe. I don't know where Aristotle got the idea, but the truth lies in the middle, and that's the idea of the counter-checker. Let me tell you, it's not compromise. It's not, hey, let me meet you in the middle somewhere. It's let me deal with this complexity of both sides seeing clearly and turn it into a single set of glasses that I can utilize in order to see better and lead better. There? All right. So we get into in the third class that he finally has, and I'll close here, of the subclass of the gay liberation, and specifically here the black gay liberation movement. We have people, almost done, babe. We have people who are sinning, and we're all sinners, and we all fall short of the glory of God. And some of us are addicts, and we can't get off of it no matter how hard we try. And if any one of us were to try to just be justified under God to never sin by our works, having become entirely pure, what my theology tells me, and this is a sound and universal theology, is no man is capable of creating his own eternal life. That life itself has to be borrowed in order to continue. Now, my cells reproduce for a little while, and then they stop. And we're all under that same condition of having a very limited life. And we're trying to use technology to change that to some extent. And if you asked a person, hey, would you like to live forever? A lot of people would say no. They wouldn't want to be stuck in their bodies forever. They actually want to put an end to it at some point, and they want to have some peace, especially when you get old and rickety and your body starts to hurt. And life is pain. But, and with health costs, when you get older, all of a sudden, now you got a new bill to deal with. And luck has an awful lot to do with survival in old age. Are you lucky enough to have good health all your life? Because you could be doing all the right things. And I've had people that have said, well, the reason you struggle with poverty is that you weren't smart. Well, yeah, tell that to my wife, who had a stroke and can't walk right? All right, so when it comes to movements that are traditionally condemned and singled out, that's a fundamental problem that we have, because we do need to know how to love one another and overlook sin. And I've been quoting James a lot here, so I'll do it again. We're under the law of liberty. So whoever would judge a brother and complain against a brother judges the law and complains against the law. But if you're a judge of the law and not a doer of the law, you're a judge. Well, there's only one judge and lawgiver, the one who's able to save or destroy. So who are you who are judging your neighbor? So obviously, judgment without mercy is going to be merciless when we all are judged by that judge and lawgiver who's standing right next to the door. And my wife may be the judge. So God bless you all. I just thought I'd share these thoughts. It's been almost an hour, and so I'm going to close, and thank you for your patience with that. But I had a lot to say, and I want you to go to the jamescarvin.com website and look up asanalogonomy. It's on one of the menu choices that you can go to there, and find out more about what incentivized asanalogonomy is if you really are interested in a solution that's wearing all the lenses. All right. Well, God bless you all. Take care now.